Hello everyone, the Archelon is a game-changing tame. This creature is going to change the game of Ark for forever. Now the Archelon is a mod from Garuga123, however it is one of the Ark Editions mods, meaning this will be coming to the official base game in the near future. Now recently this creature did go through and receive a TLC, which went through and actually updated its appearance, but it's its abilities that are actually going to change the game. Now we'll be discussing everything here in this guide, including how to tame it, but the taming portion is quite easy, so I will save that for the end. I want to get into the good stuff and the reason you clicked here on the video. So first and foremost is the algae. Now the algae is something that is generated passively. It is crucial to understand that this tame is not to be tamed for combat. They do possess some combat abilities, just something as simple as a basic attack, and that basic attack does go through and allow you to do more damage to the jellyfish, and then you do get a small buff outside of that afterwards against other creatures because you ate the jellyfish. But combat wise, that is it. You are going to want to tame this creature specifically for the algae. Now there's two specific reasons you will want to do this. One, you can actually use the algae and peel it off the turtle, which will generate passively. So basically once you tame the turtle, you will have a 2-hour window where it will go through and basically slowly accumulate this algae. But there is a trick here. There are two things that will actually affect how much algae you get and how quick you can get it. So first and foremost, it does take you 2 full hours if you allow it to passively generate while you are on land. However, if you are to take your turtle out to the ocean or to the water and let them sit there, you will actually reduce that total time down to 1 hour. This actually is going to go through and increase the production of the algae, essentially making it quicker for you to go through and get a full harvest. Now the second thing that will influence how much algae you get is actually going to be your food stat. Now you will notice that if you go through and increase different stats, none of these stats, including the food stat, will affect the timer. The only way to reduce the timer is by going through and basically waiting in the water. Now once you are in the water though, you can see if you increase the food stat, so we'll go through and I gave this guy max levels here, and if we go through and give him all 88 points into the food stat, you saw how much algae he had here at the start, and then we go back and reflect how much algae he actually has available to go through and to harvest. You'll notice that that number went up by quite a significant portion. So basically what you're going to want to go through and do is you're going to want to heavily invest in every single point here in the health pool. And basically this will be a creature you would primarily keep around your base to go through and passively use them to generate this algae. You can go through and create a small little herd of these guys and essentially just leave them in a small pool of water around your base. And even if you want to breed them up and go through and get some mutations in the food stat so they can produce more for you. So I've told you how to get the maximum harvest on the algae, but here is where it actually is game changing. The algae itself can be used with two primary different purposes. One, you can actually just feed the algae directly to a creature. Now, if you leave an algae in any herbivore's inventory, they will actually go through and eat it as if they were eating berries. So you do want to be careful, as this is a valuable resource, and clearly waiting 1 or 2 hours is a good portion of time. So I would not recommend you put it in your creature's inventory, just for the simple fact that they will go through and gobble it up pretty quickly. But what you can do with algae is you can actually use it to tame creatures. So when it comes to herbivores, they can be pretty pesky eaters, and they're pretty picky. Give them berries and it takes a long time. Then the next step up is going to be crops, and then you have your kibble. Well, algae is essentially an herbivore's version of mutton. It goes through and gives a pretty decent taming effectiveness for going through and being able to eat it. So you can see here on this Bronto, we went through and fed him a piece of kibble, which granted him 30%. And then you can go through and see that when we fed him the berry, it was pretty minimal. But when you go through and feed him the algae, you get just over 10%, which is a pretty good chunk if you consider the fact that if you leave them here in the water, and you saw earlier that basically within an hour I was able to generate almost 40 pieces with this guy at max level, that means essentially 10 pieces of algae would have gone through and tamed this Bronto. Now I don't know what level this Bronto was, I honestly do forget, it probably says it there on screen, but it's pretty crucial. This is a pretty game-changing tactic to be able to go through and have this ability to tame herbivores prior to getting higher tiers of kibble. This can certainly be helpful. But the big difference between algae and mutton is that mutton tends to expire pretty quickly. So usually you'd go through and kill yourself some sheeps, and once you do go through and kill them, or even breeding them, for example, you start the spoil timer. Now with the algae, all you have to do is just leave it on your turtle. Don't go through and harvest it until you're ready to actually use it, because the spoil timer for the algae will not start until you actually go through and peel it off the turtle. And then once you do, you'll have yourself a nice little stack, and then you can go through and put it in the fridge to go through and actually extend the duration of the algae just like you can with crops and berries. Now that is not the only use for the algae though. You can actually go through and use the algae to make yourself an algae sushi roll. Now you will need a couple of different things outside the algae to actually make this, but nothing that's too crazy outside of the white dye, which is kind of random, but I guess that's what makes the rice essentially. And yeah, you're going to go through and use this algae to make the algae sushi roll. Now it'll basically tell you here in the text, it seems straightforward, but there's so much more to it than that. Essentially, you cannot feed it to your creatures to tame them, but you can go through and to feed it to creatures to go through and essentially make up for taming percentages that are lost. Now, taming percentages get lost in two different ways. One, if a creature is injured during the taming process, specifically like with your knockout tames, that happens to everyone. I would say at least once a playthrough, you knock something out and something else hits it during that process, and immediately it's gone. You feel like it's a wasted tame because it lost taming effectiveness. However, with the algae, you can actually go through and feed it to the creature. The creature will not passively eat this. You must go through and force feed it to them, so put it in their inventory and then click the feed option, and they will go through and actually consume this. Now, there is a timer on this, so you can see here when I went through and used it on this pterodon, it recovered about 6 to 7% of its taming effectiveness, and then you notice I had roughly a 3-minute cooldown. But I was able to go through and use multiple different pieces to where I went through basically having an 80% taming effectiveness back up to a nearly perfect taming effectiveness. This will not go through and grant you 100% taming effectiveness no matter how much you feed it. It will always be 99.9. That is the max that you can go. So even if you do get, for example, a 140 tame like this pterodon, you cannot get a 210. It will always be a 209 because it will always go to 99.9%. However, that is not the only way you lose taming effectiveness. The other way you lose taming effectiveness is if you use a specific item that the creature has to eat a lot of. For example, if you were to go through and if I would have fed this pterodon raw meat versus raw prime meat, that would have taken him a lot longer to eat. But if I would have had some of this sushi available, for example, as he lost taming effectiveness, I could go through and force feed him this sushi to make up for that lost taming effectiveness. Essentially what this means is that if you don't have higher tiers of kibble or higher levels of food, if you don't have the absolute best thing to feed a tame, if you have some of this algae sushi and you bring it with you, that can make up for that fact. Now, of course, this does mean that it will still take longer feeds for that creature to go through and to tame, but if you can keep them safe, or if you're not worried about them getting damaged or hurt in any capacity, then you can go through and just use this to make up for the lack of the actual appropriate taming food. And this is absolutely game-changing. This is huge, especially with a lot of herbivores that require higher tiers of kibble. Early on, they can be such a pain or a nuisance to go through and to tame. So if you have something like the algae, you can go through and use algae to actually use as a taming food. Let's say if you don't have kibble yet, and then you can use the algae sushi to go through and to make up for some of the lost taming effectiveness, essentially guaranteeing you a perfect tame on the majority of the herbivores, like the beaver or the thiggers. You may have to go through and manage their torpor with some narcotics, but basically this means you can get a perfect tame on a lot of those more difficult creatures to tame without actually having to go through and to get to the point of where you're able to use kibble. And that is completely game-changing. So that is why this creature is going to go through and change the game of Ark. It is currently still a mod, but currently this is what it looks like to go through and to use this creature. And it's important to understand that the TLC for this creature was to go through and to test his abilities out through a mod to see if they were actually going to be a good fit for the game. So we'll definitely want to go through and monitor the progress and the updates on this TLC to see if anything changes. If not, maybe this is exactly what we see in the base game. Alright, so that is the primary abilities, but let's go through and talk about how to tame this one. Essentially, they are just a passive tame. You'll find them floating around in the water here, and they tend to be in a little bit more deeper water than you'll find them near the shores, but they can essentially be found everywhere in the ocean, and you can tame them in two different ways. Their preferred food is biotoxin, so you might immediately think you'll want to go through and feed them biotoxin. However, the biotoxin actually does not grant them all that much taming effectiveness. You'll want to go through and use kibble if you want to tame them the fastest and get the best taming effectiveness. You can actually use the biotoxin and go through and feed it to these turtles. And when you eat the jellyfish, it will increase your damage by eating them. But if you were to just give it a stack of biotoxin and you force feed it, it does not gain that same buff, but it does heal significantly faster by eating the biotoxin. So there is that. The only downside to that I see is that jellyfish were significantly reduced. Their spawn rates were reduced pretty much everywhere in Ark Survival Ascended. So I would say it's probably more difficult to go through and to acquire this specific buff, if you will, or even biotoxin in general as a preferred food. Now, another thing that is worth noting here is actually its saddle. So the saddle was actually redesigned here for this TLC, and the saddle allows you to go through and ride specifically as the rider, and then there's actually 4 other people who can ride there with you. Now, if you are riding the saddle itself, or if you are basically on top of the saddle within close proximity, it will grant you oxygen. Now, this is important because you actually do not unlock the scuba gear until later on, right around level 80. I believe it's level 81. Well, you unlock the saddle for this guy in your level 40s, meaning that you have access to oxygen or to deep dive or go farther by just having access to this tame. and it's a pretty straightforward tame. And they, like I mentioned, they are immune to the jellyfish stuns. You can be grabbed by a Tuso. That is an important thing that I do want to mention, that Tusos can still grab you. You are not that big, so they're not completely overpowered in that capacity. Like I mentioned, they're not much of a fighter, more of a travel mount, and they do swim pretty darn fast. Speaking of the swimming though, the overall fluid motion of this turtle is fantastic. You'll notice that when he crawls up on the land, it has a pretty, real life, realistic concept of how a turtle would go through and push itself across the sand. Now, when you are in the water though, this movement really shines. A lot of creatures like the Megalodon, for example, or the Sarco, have pretty rough turn radiuses, and it's really difficult to go through and to turn around to hit a creature that is directly behind you, or to just pivot on a dime. This creature can go through and essentially spin a 360 right where it's at in the water, and as you go through and move from straight to turning to straight, there's no real jerky motions. It is a pretty fluid movement, and it looks very clean, and it doesn't even feel like you're, playing the same game, because a lot of the other creatures do have that more jerky sensation when turning. Another thing to go through in the note here is that essentially if you went to go through and to dive, you would hold the button that you're going to go through and use to crouch, and if you want to ascend, you would hold the jump button to go through and to ascend, and they also do both of those at a pretty significant speed. Now, there is one last thing that is worth mentioning here on the saddle, and that's when you're actually using the saddle, if you are the rider, you are incapable of using the spyglass. You will see as I go through an attempt to use the spyglass, it will actually not pull it out. As a passenger, you can use it. So that also means there's 4 different passengers. If you had a surfer or a group of people you were playing with, they could all have crossbows, for example, meaning if you wanted to tame something, this would be the guy, because he is just this beefy tank. You can have 4 different players line up on it, and if you want to go take down this big giant creature, tame yourself up a huge group of different creatures, or even take down like an alpha, the fact that you could all sit here and be in the saddle and fire away, the DPS on this creature through the passengers who are riding would be huge and awesome, because a lot of other creatures underwater have platform saddles, but they really don't have multi-person saddles like this does. This will completely change how larger groups or tribes can actually go through and approach the water, because they can essentially do it all on just one creature. And yeah, that can be pretty scary and intimidating if a turtle comes out of nowhere and all of a sudden there's 5 players there and 4 of them can be armed, with different weapons or crossbows, etc. So this creature is monumental for the game, and I really hope, exactly as it is, it does come to the game, because this is really cool, and I don't think it's overpowered. I just think it has so much unique kit to it. And my absolute favorite part about this creature is that the creature is simplistic. There is no complicated taming. The taming is straightforward. It's passive. There is no complicated over-the-top abilities. It has one ability, just a basic attack when it comes to combat. But then all of its other abilities are abilities that go through and allow it to be a utility tame. Truly a utility tame, one that works passively and can go through and generate you resources and different taming food, and then one that you can have utility in the water with traversal by having a saddle that can carry 5 people in total. And that is why I think this is a fantastic tame and a fantastic mod, and if you have not checked it out, I highly recommend you definitely do so. And again, this is by Garuga123. Alright, and that about wraps it up here for the guide for the Archelon. If you did enjoy today's video, then please consider leaving a like and subscribing if you're not already.